so I'll start today by talking about articulatory setting and just defining it for those of you who don't know what it is. And I'll go over some of the literature on it and what we've found in my lab and others have found in their labs. And particularly I'll talk about bilinguals and their articulatory settings, and bilinguals of different proficiencies as well. So first of all, let me talk about articulatory setting, give you a definition for it. So Beatrice Honigman in 1964 was the one who coined the term articulatory setting, and she called it the gross oral posture and mechanics of a language. And she said, and I quote, "Watching the speakers in, say, French, Russian, and English films, it's interesting to note the difference between these in look about the mouth and jaw, and the similarity of lip-jaw look of the individual speakers in any one of them." Of course, this is parts of that are a gross generalization, but let's go on to the next part. Can an articulatory setting be learned? Can a language's articulatory setting be learned, or is it simply a byproduct of learning to produce speech? Does it emerge from learning speech? This is something that we are trying to research, and much more research is needed in that direction. Honigman insisted that learning the pronunciation of a second language involves first learning its articulatory setting, that you wouldn't be able to pronounce it properly. Well, when I say properly, you wouldn't be able to pronounce it as a native speaker would unless you first learn its articulatory setting. We and other labs have had success teaching articulation with the aid of ultrasound, but of course it's difficult to teach tongue articulation without that. It seems to take a long time for people to know where their tongue is in their mouth and what it's touching, and to be aware of that if they are naive. Teaching articulatory setting, a lot of authors, a lot of researchers have called for the idea of teaching articulatory setting in pronunciation classes, in language classes, and there's a big list of people there, applied linguists and linguists, many of them very well known. The origin of articulatory setting, where does it come from? Well, I'll read three quotes about articulatory setting: Honigman 64, Laver 2000, and Jick tomorrow. Honigman 64 said, articulatory setting is determined to a great extent by the most frequently occurring sounds and sound combinations in that language. Laver 2000 said it could be an emergent property of segmental performance. And Jick said, or will say, I guarantee you, I bet my life on it, he will say tomorrow, that articulatory setting is constantly maintained, a constantly maintained set of tonic muscle activations that co-articulates globally. The first two there are really not a new idea. Wilkins, 300 years before that, in 1668, this was cited in Laver, said, another different mode of pronunciation betwixt several nations may be in regard of strength and distinctness of pronouncing, which will specially appear in those kind of letters which do most abound in a language. So there's a 300-year-old quote about articulatory setting, or you know, the same idea. Because this is an acoustics conference, I should mention a long-term average spectrum as well. Long-term average spectrum is really not equal to articulatory setting. Articulatory setting is underlying, but it may co-articulate or be overridden by articulation of some phonemes. And more importantly, long-term average spectrum doesn't tell us how to make an underlying articulatory setting if you're trying to teach it to learners. How do we measure articulatory setting? If it's underlying, then it's a position that articulators briefly return to during pauses, and I'll call the pause interspeech posture, ISP. So you'll see that acronym in the rest of the slides. ISP is different from absolute rest position. And Ramanarayanan et al. A couple of years ago used real-time MRI data and showed that ISP is mechanically advantageous to absolute rest position when you're trying to model speech. Jick, Wilson, Koch, and Cook in 2004 first measured articulatory setting through ISP. And we found significant differences between 5 English and 5 French, Canadian English and Quebecois French participants, ISPs, in old X-ray movies of speech. Those are from Munhall et al. We found significant differences between English and French for numbers 1, so the distance between the tongue root and the pharyngeal back of the pharynx, the distance between the tongue body up here and the palate. Yes, you can see the little red cursor, and the distance between the tongue tip and the hard palate here, and both upper lip and lower lip protrusion. So those were the differences that were found between English and French. We also found that ISP behaves like a target. So not only are there differences between the language's rest positions, interspeech postures, but ISP also has as little variability, no less variability than E, than the vowel E, which has relatively little variability according to Perkel and Nelson. So that's all well and good with monolingual group comparison, but one problem that you have, of course, comparing monolingual groups is that you have to normalize for vocal tract size differences. And using bilinguals, this problem disappears because you're comparing the same vocal tract to the same vocal tract. So what Brian Jick and I did a couple of years ago, we wrote this up in JSLHR. We measured 4 bilinguals, and well, actually we measured more than 4, but 4 that were perceived to be native-like in both of their languages, English and French. We found that only those 4 that were perceived to be native-like had different lip protrusion. So only those 4 and all of those 4. And 2 of them, 2 out of the 4, had different tongue tip height in their English rest position compared to their French rest position. And that was an Optic and ultrasound experiment that we did. In that experiment, we used a method of measurement that was a fixed point comparison. So we measured the distance from the probe up to 4 points on the tongue, and we used the alveolar ridge to determine where the tongue tip line was going to be. The alveolar ridge point, which is approximately here, there's a tiny red dot that you probably can't see, but the big red cursor is on it now. That point was determined via a swallowing frame, a different frame that we could see the alveolar ridge in. And this dot down here is at the center of the probe. The user clicked on the tongue as far back as he could down here, close to the hyoid shadow, and then MATLAB would draw 2 lines, the red line here and the yellow line here, and then trisect the angle by drawing 2 more lines. After that, the user had to click on the points on the tongue where the lines intersected the tongue. So it was kind of a labor-intensive measurement system, but we were able to find differences measured along those lines comparing English and French rest position. Now, we have reanalyzed that data very recently, and a student of mine, Yuki Iguro, who's sitting down there, and I and Julian Villegas will present a poster tomorrow, and we used SS ANOVA to reanalyze the tongue curves. And English, I won't steal Yuki's thunder, but I'll just tell you that English had a greater tongue dorsum height and tongue root retraction than French did for all 4 of those bilinguals who were perceived to be native in each of their languages. So this was interesting. Using this method, we were able to find out something that we had not found out before using the other measurement method. And you can go and see Yuki's poster for all the gory details. Okay. Japanese-English bilinguals, ISPs. Let's move on to a different language pair now. So we talked about English and French and bilinguals who were perceived to be native in each of their languages. How about Japanese and English? And in particular, in this case, Japanese participants whose English was fairly low proficiency. So in Wilson et al. 2015, we measured bilinguals, 4 bilinguals who were low proficiency English, and we found a number of things. So again, we used SS ANOVA, and here on the right side you can see 4 graphs for 4 different participants. Okay. Oh, we seem to have lost the shading. Interesting. Okay, there was shading for 95% confidence interval when I opened it on my Mac computer this morning, but it's now gone. So I don't know where it went. Anyway, what I was going to say is that the shading shows, or the shading did show this morning, trust me, that it's more variable in their ISP in second language English than in first language Japanese. So we had a big wide confidence interval for the red, which is the English. The blue line is the Japanese, is their native Japanese. Okay, so, and also we see that the tongue dorsum and the tongue body is significantly higher for English than it is for Japanese. And this was surprising because these are low proficiency speakers of English. So why should they use a different rest position for their second language, which they don't speak very well, which they speak with a heavy accent? Why use a different rest position when it would be more efficient to use their first language rest position? So this was kind of weird, and we don't really have a great explanation, and if anyone has one, I'd be happy to hear. But we thought perhaps they're more nervous in their second language, they're tense, their tongue body is raised, their tongue dorsum is raised, I don't know. So this was an experiment that we did with ultrasound and also Vicon MX motion tracking of the lips, jaw, and probe. Okay, we also did another experiment, this time looking at the coronal plane, and Wilson and Canada in 2014 looked at the marker on the side of the tongue. So over here, we placed a marker on the side of the tongue, and we followed its movement in the coronal plane. And we found, interestingly, that the position of the side marker during pre-speech posture, now we looked at pre-speech posture instead of ISP for that experiment. We were forced to because of the data set that we were using. It was less efficient, the position of the side marker, less efficient for L2 speakers of English than for native speakers. And in the next slide, you'll see why I say that. So in this slide, what you see is the position of the side marker in the coronal plane. This is the coronal plane. So this is millimeters from the bite plane. So this up here, number 3, is 3 millimeters down from the bite plane. So the bite plane's up here somewhere for this participant. This is English, Canadian male participant, so native English speaker. This is an American male native English speaker. And these are 2 Japanese speakers at the bottom. A Japanese female who is low proficiency, speaks with a strong accent, and a Japanese male who is high proficiency, almost near native. And what you see here is in the gray, you see the position of the side marker. Sorry, I didn't identify the horizontal axis. This is millimeters from the mid-sagittal. So the mid-sagittal, this is 21 millimeters from the mid-sagittal. Mid-sagittal is over to the left 21 millimeters. So 23 millimeters, 25 from the mid-sagittal. So the tongue side marker is moving up towards the mid-sagittal and down away from the mid-sagittal. Okay, and what you see here in black, you see the pre-speech posture. So where that side marker was before you start speaking, just before you start speaking. In the gray, you see where it is during the whole sequence of speech. Okay, so you notice that for these two native speakers, the average tongue position for pre-speech posture in black is around the same as the average tongue position for speech. Now it's a little off the mean, but it's closer than this one down here, which is a low proficiency Japanese speaker, and her pre-speech posture was much more towards the mid-sagittal, the side tongue marker. So in other words, her tongue was either, well, it was very much narrowed from the rest of her speech here. For the Japanese male who was very close to being native, not much of a perceptible accent at all, his pre-speech posture was actually reflected in what his speech position was for the side marker. So that was an interesting finding that in the coronal plane. Now, this is just another application of this. Could foreign accent syndrome result from damage to the cerebellum that changes the underlying articulatory settings? In an articulatory computer model of speech production, would it be possible to induce foreign accent syndrome simply by changing the ISP? An interesting thing to look at in computer modeling of speech. Future research directions: does a tongue configuration based on weighting of type frequency of phonemes or token frequency of phonemes match with the attested interspeech posture or rest position? Is interspeech posture sometimes different from the predominant phonemes of a language in order to make those phonemes more perceptively distinct? So, in other words, do we perceive not the static positions of the articulators, but the change from one position to the next, and from one ISP, from one phoneme to an ISP and back out? A couple more future research directions. Test whether ISP is task dependent. So is it different for natural speech versus read speech? So far we've just tested it on read speech, just because of the need for tight control for measurement. Nonsense words versus real words, and so on. And finally, test what is perceptually salient in ISP, how much can be read in the face. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Dr. Atsuo Suemitsu for running EMMA at JICE, Dr. Donna Erickson for helping us with the EMMA data, and some Kakenhi grants from the JSPS and grants from the University of Aizu. Thank you.